Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you to today's the second webinar in Passerelle's webinar series. And I know people are just starting to filter in, and so I want to welcome you to our webinar today. Today we have, we're pleased to be joined by Dr. Stephanie Bartlett, who will be talking about collaboration unplugged, how belonging and relationships can enhance your team. And so we're looking forward to the webinar today. Before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment to, to recognize that Passerelle's central office is situated on what is known as Quebec City, on the traditional unceded territory of the Huron-Wendat people, the Innu, the Malasite, the Atikamekw, and Abenaki people. And in the spirit of respect and reconciliation, we extend our gratitude to these nations for the stewardship of this land where we work, live, and play. And before we jump into today's webinar, I just wanted to give a quick promotional highlight for our next webinar in the webinar series. It'll be with great pleasure to welcome Dr. Simon Bacon, who will be talking about improving quality and reducing waste in the designing and testing of interventions, targeting physical activity, diet, and other health risk behaviors. And that webinar will take place on March 21st from 12 to 1 p.m. And again, as with today's webinar, it'll be followed by a half-hour session for the Passerelle Fellows, where they'll have an opportunity to do a meet and greet and discussion with Dr. Bacon. So for those of you who don't know, I'm Rob Van Horn. I'm the operations manager for Passerelle, and I have the pleasure today to welcome Dr. Stephanie Bartlett for this webinar. And again, she'll be talking about how belonging and relationships can enhance your team. She's a relational leadership consultant, postdoctoral scholar, and sessional instructor at the Werklund School of Education at the University of Calgary. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Bartlett and turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Rob. And hi, I'm really happy to be here and I appreciate the warm welcome. I'll just take a second to share my slides and then we'll get going. Okay, I'm assuming you can see my slides.
Yeah, it looks good.
Thank you. Okay, I will start with another layer of the land acknowledgement on top, just to recognize that I'm coming to you from Mohkinstsis, what is now known as Calgary. And this is a picture of Noah's Hill in Calgary looking to the east with the sun rising. It's the traditional home of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, the Kainai, Piikani, and the Tsuut'ina First Nations and Stoney Nakoda First Nations, comprised of the Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Goodstoney First Nations. And also Calgary is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Districts 5 and 6. And they also acknowledge all beings, all humans, and all more than human beings who make their home here in Southern Alberta. And I always I'm very connected. You'll see as we go through, my work is very connected to land and place. And so I was out walking the dog this morning and looked up and I saw a beautiful arrangement of, I think they're starlings. But thinking about how we were doing this talk on collaboration today, seeing them fly in this beautiful flock and the movement and the formation made me think it was an incredible lesson for working together and apparently seamlessly moving through the sky. So I wanted to just begin with that. And it's also very cold here, and I think it's probably cold in Montreal as well. So just that feeling of winter, it's a great time for stories, and also the earth is resting. So that is how I come to you today on this winter day. And just another addition of who I am. I come from the West Coast, and so I grew up on what is what was Coast Salish Lands, what is now Vancouver. And I really identify with rocks, rivers, oceans, mountains. And I've made my home in Calgary for the last 18 years with my family. And I do come to be here in this work I started a journey into collaborative creativity, co-design, social innovation, and entrepreneurship over a dozen years ago, and have spent all of this time looking at systems, taking down barriers, shifting my practice, my personal life, my outlook, and as I'll explain as we get through this. But it's been really, really transformational. And then in the last 10 years or so, have been on a very intentional, guided learning journey to learn Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing respectfully as a Scottish and English a woman of Scottish and English heritage. And so that has become another part of my journey that is really essential in the work that I lead. Okay, so for today, I want to first of all add a note about the slides. The first few slides, I have chosen to have pictures that have ripples of water because I'm thinking of these as ideas that will drop into the water and they'll spread out. And as they spread out, sometimes it takes a very short amount of time for these ripples to reach other people and create change. And sometimes they keep going and going and going. And we never know the full reach of the ripples, but just that idea of enacting change by dropping the pebbles in. So those will be that's the kind of thread of the first few slides. And then you'll notice that it switches to almost like a full ecosystem of mountains and rivers and trees. And for me, I add these because that is the site of where I spent a lot of time during my PhD research. And by learning alongside an elder, having a guided learning journey, and then also really having a place in this place of the mountains where I felt really called to write and to learn, really impacted. I started to really understand how I could spend time in nature and feel connected. And also that had an influence on how I designed and worked with groups. And so I just wanted to call attention to the visuals also. And let's get started. So we've done our welcome. I want to just go through, I have questions for the agenda. So what is going on in the world? What is possible? How do we get there? And what is the action plan? And then, of course, questions at the end. And if you have questions, I believe we'll hold those for the end, and then we'll have questions and conversation afterwards. And I'll be happy to answer any questions for you. Okay, so with the first section, what is going on right now? Think about the status quo. So painting a picture of this ecosystem that we're living in right now. You know, across different systems, there's accountability measures, and we have results are really driving our productivity. We're expected to deliver. We're expected to work well on teams, manage our families, manage our personal wellness, take care to incorporate diversity, equity, inclusion, and to pay attention to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. We're expected to co-design and work well in co-design groups and further our research and engage, I know for this audience, engage deeply in patient-oriented research and make those movements into incredible work with incredible results. But all of this is in a post-COVID world that's really heavily implicated. We live in colonial systems. Those systems are ongoing. We also, there's a lot of tensions that we're feeling right now with the climate crisis, with the geo-socio-political movements and changes that we're living through right now. So I share all of that as our status quo because it's feels unbalanced, and yet we're still coming to work and really expected to be fully on our game. And so the other day I was leading a group it was during a relational welcome. I always like to go around and either have an expression of gratitude or have people share what's going on in their hearts. And overwhelmingly, people were sharing how tired they were feeling and how they couldn't look away from what was going on. But the outcome of this conversation was that we shared, people came as humans to talk about what is going on for them in their lives and how difficult it was for them to be productive in their work. And then we were able to share that, relate to each other, and then that was almost like a reset where we could shift and focus into really deep collaborative work. And so just having that moment to connect. And also, whether I'm working with educators in graduate programs or pre-service teachers, researchers, and communities in my postdoctoral research, working with nonprofits and schools and corporations and businesses, I see this pattern playing out where it's almost like we're going through life on autopilot, or not everyone, but autopilot, and kind of unconscious of some of the possibilities that arrive, and we're just wanting to get work done in expected and efficient ways that can either miss important ways of working together in different ways that simultaneously work to undo colonialism, shift power dynamics, and enact equity, diversity, and inclusion. So, and that, all of that to share is it's very complicated, this status quo that we're living in right now. It's very complicated. And, this is a movement to be more, to become awake and to awaken to different possibilities of how to deepen incredible work that you already do, and how to deepen it in a way that welcomes you also in as humans into your work, fully human with the personal and professional. And so when I'm working with groups, no matter who I'm doing it with and where I'm doing it, land, community, and relationships are at the center of any design work that I do. And this is intentional. I try always to interrupt colonial systems, no matter what groups I'm working with. And so when I see groups who are deeply engaged, when we're working together, for example, working with a group over a 5-day summer intensive, we were working through design and social innovation in the realm of education. But I was really teaching the protocols and practices of collaboration. And so then you could start to see people who were so deep in this process. They were really leaning into each other. And you can literally see the dynamic shift. You can see people physically leaning into each other. You can see these relationships building and deeper connections, and starting to understand that what they are doing, they could not do on their own. And so I see that with when groups have an enhanced productivity that didn't need to be monitored because they are so motivated to do it. So I'm always curious about, when this happens, why couldn't everything be this way? Why couldn't, all of our work environments and teams be this way, where we're leaning into the work in a very different way than what we're used to? And so what would happen? What would happen if we got to a place where we could experience this feeling? And what if this was the status quo? And so when I started to see these effects in groups over 10 years ago, I have been steadily working to adapt my own practice, to put this into motion, because I always like to be able to walk the talk. And so to practice at how, if I prioritized collaboration and if I prioritized a land practice and connection in my own work, what would what happens when I lead other people to do the same? And so here, my slide, I've got blue sky dreaming. And so what if we created an inclusive, cohesive climate at work? And what would happen if you knew that your voice, your presence, your perspective, your positionality of who you are and where you come from, and your professional expertise and knowledge. What if you knew that all of this was always valued and trusted in a group that you're working with? And how could this kind of deep collaboration really transform workplaces and ways of working together and results? So this is my blue sky dreaming, because there's some things that are in the way. There are barriers and there are systems and things that we can work around. So when I talked about the status quo and talked about barriers, or that people are feeling a lot of overwhelm right now, then we have ongoing colonial systems through all levels of government, society, and organization. Ways of conducting research are predominantly Western, and across qualitative and quantitative research, the Western worldview is prioritized. And so it makes it hard to shift these dynamics because it's hard to imagine another way. And power dynamics are really ingrained in colonial systems, and hierarchical leadership instead of leading shared leadership and leading with heart and through circle, prioritizing heart instead of head sometimes, or as a combination. And I just see that there's a question in the chat, so I'll take a quick, oops, my chat has disappeared. Sorry, I will get to this in a second. And then and so these barriers too are in co-design groups. Sometimes we can talk about groups and things that need to happen instead of always with them from every stage, and prioritizing also this Western worldview. Also, what can be inherent in systems and just present is, despite best intentions, systems are set up for othering versus like cultivating a true place of belonging. And so these systems don't care and nurture for a different way of doing things that is more relational. And these systems also don't care for us and help us do our best in that way, and also prioritize wellness of teams and groups. And so these are some of the things in the way. And so it's good to be aware of some of these pieces that are in the way so that we can find workarounds and get in there. So here's what we can do. These are things that will follow that we'll get into, where this is like an antidote to the existing systems, these existing barriers that we have. And so here, one would be nurturing cultures of belonging. And so to really interrupt that status quo that I've painted, and to build relationships, thinking about positionality. This is your identity, who you are, who your ancestors are, your stories, where you come from, and really welcoming that into part of the group beyond work titles. And embodying and practicing anti-racist and anti-oppressive ways of being together as a practice. And also, it can feel almost unnatural, but slowing down the work to take time with relationships in order to speed up. And an example of that is I am president of a curriculum group, Canadian Association for Curriculum Studies. And we, at the beginning of every meeting, prioritize a relational welcome. So this takes about 10 to 20 minutes. There's a check-in about, how are you feeling? How are you feeling today? Or what is something that you have learned this week and something that you love? And also maybe an expression of gratitude. And this, depending on how many people are in the meeting, there's typically about just over 20. So it takes about 10 to 20 minutes, depending, at the beginning of the meeting. And this can feel almost like, why are we why are we prioritizing this, but then always getting the work done without fail within the time frame of the meeting. But people feel welcomed, and we get emails at the end of every meeting of how people really feel so welcomed and peaceful in those meetings, and recognizing we're still getting work done. Okay, so I'm just looking at the chat here about what does beyond work titles mean specifically. Okay, so I find that a lot of lots of us, we come to work and we might the work title that you might have on the team might be researcher or professor or practitioner and or educator. And so when you might just paint the day. So get up in the morning. If you have a family, you're helping your family get out the door. You are taking in time maybe for exercise and wellness. You have concerns and worries about family, extended family, things going on in the world. And when we get into the workplace, a lot of times it's like you almost like compartmentalize that and then just get into the work, and that's what I mean. And so there's that shift of showing up to have this relational welcome that I was just talking about, to honor the positionality of, it's really interesting to learn and take the time to find out where people are from and their ancestors and the stories and their connections in different ways outside of work. And it's just another level of building relationships. And so that's what I mean. And not to say, of course you can show up feeling, your best self to work, but lots of times we just don't talk about or don't bring up the other aspects of who we are as a holistic human. And so this is just going a level beyond to build relationships right into the fabric. And so I find that a lot of groups who, when we continually do this work of who we are as fully human, and people have the chance to articulate how they're feeling on any given day, it seems to just take a layer off of sometimes the stress that we carry or the compartmentalizing of our day. So I hope that answers your question. Okay, and that was beautifully related to this, just finishing up with that meeting that I was talking about, how when we do that relational welcome and without fail, and I've been in this role for 2 years now, I always receive emails at the end of the meeting from people who say that, out of a day with back-to-back-to-back meetings, then this was the one meeting where they felt very heard and valued and calm, and still recognized that we're getting work done. And so also another way to kind of get through the barriers and create these spaces that really enable beautiful collaboration on co-design teams is to a practice of creating courageous spaces. And I say courageous instead of safe, because I can't guarantee what is safe for me might not be safe for someone else. And so also courageous in the space that people can speak up if they have questions or concerns, and know that it will be honored. And so holding in these courageous spaces, I always like to physically rearrange the furniture and meet in circles as shared leadership, and honoring that respect, responsibility, relationships, and reciprocity that is so common in Indigenous teachings and ways of being and doing and knowing. And so also by having these circles, just a quick story. I was I was working with a group of students, pre-service teachers last week, a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about, we got to a space where people were sharing what it felt like to be marginalized, and how sometimes if they were perhaps the only person of color in their group, that talking about the weight of representation of their culture and how that feels and how it feels to be in the group. And so in this courageous space that we have cultivated, there was another student who asked about that comment, when people say we're all Canadian, and that, what does that mean in this moment? And this is really interesting because we had clearly created a space that was courageous enough for this person to speak into that and ask this question, whether they thought that the comment, we are all Canadian, was that inclusive. And they, in fact, these students from different cultures who were speaking, they said no, that it's not that idea of being all Canadian and working together in a group. They talked about how their different identities and positionalities, that they preferred to be in a group where they could share the different cultural backgrounds and stories, but not. It was really interesting, the nuances of the courageousness to speak into the space, for them to share their experiences, and then for this other teacher to ask about that question, and for them to share candidly what that felt like and how it landed. And so there was a lot of learning. And I share this story because people can, when we create and take the time to build these courageous spaces, then people can speak and share, and there's learning, and we can do this through sharing stories and experiences that will deepen the work, because there's trust that's built and continually worked on. Okay, and so another this is very practical. I find it is one of the most effective ways of creating strong, courageous, collaborative teams. And what is really interesting is that these community agreements, this would be one of the first things that I ask a group to do. And when a group is working together for the first time, I ask a group to meet and talk about, asking questions like, how do you like to work? And how do you feel about deadlines? Are you a last minute person? Do you like having things done well ahead of time? Do you work well at night, or do you work well during the day? How do you like to communicate? Do you like to communicate face to face or over a group chat or email? And how do you like to be communicated to? This is a question we don't often think about, in this interchange of communication with each other. And also, importantly, are you a visionary or a big picture thinker, or are you more inclined to worry about fine tuning and details? And so taking the time to work through these questions and more, whatever comes up in your conversation, and to document this becomes a living document for the life cycle of your work together. And what's really amazing is that if any problems with communication or misunderstandings arise, then the group can go back to the community agreements and decide together whether or not do you need to back up and have more relational work and build trust and work on things, or what needs to happen. And so this is a very dynamic, living document for the group. It's really interesting too, because a lot of groups want to bypass this or rush through it, or write maybe the typical ways that groups would cooperate in the past. And they really point out that cooperation and collaboration are, they're really different, but often used interchangeably. And so the cooperation is almost like surface level, like everybody has a job and we get our job done, but somebody could lean out and not do their share. And also somebody could take over and do a lot of the work. And so the difference with collaboration is when you lean into this work and you have these protocols, this trust, these community agreements in place, then it's amazing the depth of the work and how the trust, the energy, and how you can notice things that you hadn't noticed before and get to somewhere where you couldn't have gotten to before. So this is really important work for teams to do, and don't rush it, don't speed through. And another piece I find that's really, really important for when we're looking at a different way of showing up, working together with collaboration in that sense of relationship and belonging, is reconciliatory practices. So in my work, I'm closely tied to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. But I also notice, in my work, it also reaches, I listen to the call of that you hear out in communities, that reconciliation is about relationships, and it's about how we connect and relate to each other, and also how, it's a future long view of reconciliation, of how we can be together differently for the future of our children, and the earth. And so this is a really long view of the work. But it's a really beautiful and natural way of embedding reconciliation, and of course, anti-racist practices are part of this. Anti-oppressive decolonial work can all be part of these reconciliatory practices. And this is just a really natural way to include this into the work and the collaboration that you do. And then it doesn't become an add-on. It is not a checklist, an item on a checklist of taking care of the work of reconciliation as something different, or the work of equity, diversity, and inclusion as something different, but it becomes part of the fabric of your collaborative group work. And so, I spoke about relational leadership and the relational meetings. I've spoken about drawing upon circle practices. And so having shared leadership and consensus in the circle rather than somebody up front talking and people facing and listening, this helps to establish consensus and these practices of establishing trust and sharing leadership. Because also on a co-design team, there's, as you well know, there are so many different skill sets and gifts and levels of expertise, and that really leaning in and leaning out of who is leading at any given time can change. And that honoring of diverse, the diverse skill sets. And so all of this is almost like a space in between a Western dominant worldview and a space in between an Indigenous worldview, respectfully. And so this holds space for something to generate and happen, a relational practice, to build relationships and share stories and perspectives with each other, to really hear each other. So I add this because this ongoing work of reconciliation is a deep part of any collaborative work that I lead, and I've made that just part of my purpose to include it as part of the fabric of how groups can come together and practice being well together. And I know I've alluded to principles of co-design as we're coming through, but this is great to bring this in right now. So these principles of co-design, I can see this. When we practice these principles, I can literally see and hear from the work of groups and teams how deeply they trust this process and each other, and conversely, when there are groups who rush through and are more on the side of cooperation versus collaboration. And so these mindsets, and so thinking about mindsets of positivity and optimism, and the trusting of the process. I know that I share with students and groups, trust the process, trust me to guide you through, and people, there's a lot of letting go, which is very different than, in a Western system when we hold really tightly to the end outcome almost immediately, we want to know exactly where we're going. And co-design is different because there's this ambiguity, not for the whole process, but at certain points, there's an ambiguity in there where we have to lean into the gray and trust. And trust that you cultivate this energy, that you've created these community agreements so that you can really dig into this work. So this is part of building the conditions of how you show up. And then also to back up, when you can invite, as part of building these conditions, invite people to show up as their full selves, then they will give so much energy and so much of the gifts that can really lean into doing incredibly productive work, and that really surpasses a lot of limits that we might set within the parameters and boundaries that we know. So I want to speak to, in co-design, to this idea of small circles and big circles and support team. And so within co-design groups, there's always a small circle of design that is constant all the way through the life cycle of the project. So I imagine in your settings, in patient-oriented research, that this would consist of researchers and patients and medical practitioners and anyone else who's deemed essential through the life cycle of this work. And so this small circle, this is when, starting with community agreements and figuring out how to build these relationships and really cultivate this and thinking about these conditions. Then the big circle is, who are the people who need to be a part of this work? And when do we lean in and lean out? When do we lean on the big circle? And when do we continually check back in with the small circle? And thinking about always that working alongside and with the people who we are trying to design. It's not designed for, but who are we designing with to improve an experience or to improve an aspect of I'm not sure, but well-being for patients, or the results that you're looking for. Who needs to be involved and who do you need to learn from? And if you are involved with, for example, Indigenous research, then you would want to, of course, involve elders or knowledge keepers or members of the community that you're working with from the very beginning. Not at any, you don't want to make this ask or this approach late into the process or even partway through. And so this would be at the beginning and part of the small circle. But just knowing that notion of small circle and big circle, that there's a small group of designers who lean in and are involved at every stage through the life cycle. And then the big circles might be somebody that you might learn from, or people that you would interact with a little bit, but they don't need to be involved in all the decisions and in the entire process the whole time. And so it's just that understanding. And then also, is there a larger support team? And this maybe is operational manager who's a part of this. And if there's HR, who is on the outside kind of supporting and making sure that everybody is well, everybody from all perspectives, so that people feel honored and well. And also within co-design, it's really important, this idea of shared decision-making and shared responsibility. And with that comes a lot of trust. I know that, lots of us want to control things all the time from the beginning into the end. I know that I will catch myself sometimes in thinking, do I need to be fully involved in what, this small group is doing or leading, or can I actually just be waiting and ready for a check-in when they're ready to share? And so that's kind of that leaning in and leaning out, and holding that space, and knowing that we're sharing the responsibility, and that we'll get to where we need to go. And the other thing I find really important is that visual tracking of the thought process as a really interesting part of co-design, because when groups come together, and I know there's the, typically in design, we've got the sticky notes that are everywhere. And, traditional design thinking was very fast paced with lots of sticky notes, idea generation, moving around the sticky notes. I'm not fully advocating for that, although I know that it's a great way to represent ideas. But also, I work with groups and I ask them to visually represent their thought process maybe in different ways. So whether they sketch some ideas, kind of get the other side of the brain working, whether they sketch or whether they, talk through just in a different way to arrange thoughts, almost like I call it sometimes a project nest of how to help the ideas grow. Also in a co-design team. So this could be visual mapping, it could be the sticky notes, it could be a sketches or a combination of all, but in one place so that you can track the pathway of the group, the learning, the development of the initiative. And then the amazing thing about tracking all of this visually, and not just in words and in writing, is that when you track all of these ideas in something called, the project nest or whatever you want to call it, including your community agreements, you can look back and revisit ideas you had that you may have disregarded or that you might have moved in a different direction. And so this idea of having a project nest as visual representation, it's really, really amazing in that coming together and that almost shared responsibility, because everyone can see themselves reflected on there. Okay, so all of this, and I know I've shared lots of different ideas of the cultures of belonging, the building relationships, reconciliatory practices. When we bring all of this together, here's what happens when we succeed and with these strong co-design teams. We'll have a growing movement of people who are disrupting systems, who feel recognized, who feel a strong sense of belonging, and really increased relationships as their whole person, and that get you increased productivity with your team also. And so all of this is, entirely possible. And here, this idea too, with this is the ultimate, what I find is if we're disrupting status quo in this way, and we're thinking about how to disrupt the status quo that I talked about through this idea of relational teams and that are co-design teams, is there's evidence of this trust, deep listening, and diverse perspectives and voices, community agreements, this ongoing relationship and an ethic of care. And I also add in a connection to land and beings, because it's really interesting across different contexts of people working, when there is time, or when you make the time to connect to land and beings. It could be your land acknowledgement, and just how I, at the beginning, talked about starlings and how the group together really had me thinking about collaborative groups. It can be connections brief like that at the beginning with how people connected to land, or whether you noticed the almost full moon this morning on your way to work. This also does something, and also gets at something also that need for humans right now to connect with the land and beings. And so this brings it into our workplace, and it really does enhance the work. Just another quick story. I was working with a group last week, and we went outside. It was freezing cold, but for 10 minutes before we started the rest of our dialogue of their professional learning, everyone went outside and we took 10 minutes to just connect. I asked the question, who is your teacher today? And so everyone went outside, and there were some people who were lying down in meditation on the snow. There were some people who were sitting under trees. Others were standing, staring up at the sky. And it looked so striking and unusual for a group of adults to be outside of the workplace, engaged in this land practice, that people who were passing by stopped. There was one person who stopped the person lying down to say, "Are you okay?" And then another person walking through asking, what is this? Is this an event? And it just called out to me how unusual it is to see a group of adults in a workplace who are also connecting with the land and then bringing in that energy to start a meeting, to start together. So it's just another way of altering. But I see this as blue sky, and how all of these different processes, there are possibilities. There are great possibilities to shift the incredible work that you're already doing. And so, what is the action you can take today? Because for me, I always think, what relative this transformation or these changes, it's never an assumption that we're not doing the work. But these are seeds that are planted, or like the beginning of the slideshow with ripples going out. How do you see yourself right now, or your team? And what is relative to where you're at right now? So what are small steps you could take to shift and change your collaborative teams even a little bit, to see just how it feels? And so when you're taking your learning forward, you could kickstart the process by thinking about that relational welcome at the beginning of meetings and maybe popping outside. You could think about your co-design teams, and is it time, if you sat down and thought about those community agreements, how would that go? And then also creating those cultures of belonging and deep collaboration, and how you can involve yourself in this daily practice that actually is a very effective, slow, but effective way at approaching systemic change. And I will stop right there, to thank you so much. And I hope that, these ideas, I hope that there's a few things that might spark opportunities and things you can do with in your groups. And I see there's a few questions in the chat, and also we'll open this up to questions and conversation. Okay.
Stephanie, thank you so much for that presentation. That was excellent, and just really enlightening, and I think provides some. I really like the visual of the ripples, and just even if it's starting small, but start somewhere, right? And so it's I think a great message to end on that point, and kind of bringing things full circle there. But yes, there's some questions in the chat here, so I'm happy to read those out to you, or however you want to do that.
Yeah, I've got them up here too, but maybe
Okay,
we
perfect.
can start back to, okay, so the next one I see is, how do you navigate the space when your community culture is going against your view? Okay, so can I just clarify that question? So if your community culture, do you mean the culture of co-design, or the community of your co-design team, if that makes sense? The culture of co-design. Okay, so that would be, back that up to the community agreements, because lots of us, and this is a really practical thing to talk about. I'm glad you asked this question, because we all have different ideas of how the work should unfold. And this is a way of almost laying it out together. And so then there wouldn't necessarily be, when you get to a place where there feels like there's tension, or that different ideas of where members of the group are differing from your view, then you can either revisit the community agreements to decide, and then again, if you have that project nest, you can redirect, like, where did this break down, and go back and you can find it, and then have evidence of also where things are going right. So that might be a way. And so, okay, so I'm seeing comment too about the culture is very closed. So I wonder if that's if that's because of the different, is that because of the different roles of the people that come on the team? Then there might be some ways of coming together. Again, it's that relational, getting to know each other beyond who we are in our positions and with our titles and experiences. I can't emphasize enough what that would do for the culture of the work. And so we can talk more about that too. And I will also leave my email also if people have. But I hope that answered the one question. And then I'll just go on to, I see this next one. Yeah, the presentation offers an ambitious and inspiring vision. It feels abstract and detached from practical realities. While the ideas are engaging, they come across as more theoretical than actionable, which might make it difficult for those facing challenges. So perhaps could you, in a few words, ground the concepts with a concrete example or a couple of real world applications? Yes. So I know that it can feel, especially because this is very different, it can feel abstract and totally unattainable. And so when there are challenges, and I'm thinking here of, each one of these, whether it's building a culture of belonging, whether it's looking at reconciliation or having this land practice, each one of these is a very concrete practice. And so it starts with how you come together and how you share who you are. So to ground a concept, so the concrete example is working with a group on, and it was stretching outside of the walls of the parameters of their work. I wanted them to come together in their co-design small groups. So this was a small group of designers. I had them work through these questions to come up with their community agreements. Then they looked at the big question or the topic of their work and their research, their inquiry together. And then they worked through this process of co-design and building out a practical, very concrete project nest that tracked their ideas and their conversations. Then they started to decide, who do we need to talk to? Who do we need to bring into the circle so that we can talk together? And then made the ask and that became a big circle. So bringing other people and voices in and welcoming them, so building that relationship also with them, but welcoming in people to understand that. So the feedback that I get through that process is the small co-design groups have told me if we were to just work through this problem on our own, we could have. But it was now reaching out to the bigger circle in the community beyond the parameters that you've already decided for yourself with your co-design group. When you reach out and talk to and learn from other people, you learn perspectives that you would not have understood or learned before. And it helps you redirect or guide the work in a way that you couldn't with all the gifts and expertise of people on the team. If you're not involving others in the conversation to learn about specific perspectives and issues and problems, then we're missing pieces. And so I hope that helps a little bit with, you could do all the work. You could make assumptions, you could do the work. And also you can reach out as much as possible to other voices. Okay. Oh, this one, many questions. Choose what excites you. Okay. The difference between safe and courageous, dissent, or ideological. Yes, managed. Okay. Let me see if I can wrap a lot of this in. Justice, discipline accomplished in this relational method. Priorities contradict. How can I share responsibility? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so when I approach, I'm going to look at these questions. So first of all, with the safe and the courageous, one thing I would just say is I think that by labeling something a safe space, I'm almost making assumption that I've decided it's safe. And that by doing that is implicitly othering people who may or may not agree that it's safe. So the courageous space is when you can hold and cultivate a space. And I go back to the circle. I really, the students I'm teaching right now at the university, the first thing we do is rearrange the room and get rid of the tables, put the laptops away until they need to be used, and start in circle for conversations. And it shifts everything. And we make sure we can see each other's eyes. And so the courageous space, when I talked a few minutes ago about that story of there were a few different women of color who were sharing how they felt the weight of representation. And then the one student who asked about the question, we were all Canadian. That was a few weeks into our work together. And we could not have had that conversation had we not built relationships. It would not have been a space. So I could say, A, it wouldn't have been a safe space for anyone to have asked that question, but it would have been hard to have had the courage to share the vulnerability. And it would have been hard to even ask the question because of the question about feeling Canadian, because there's fear involved of not wanting to disrespect or that sort of thing. So we were able to navigate through this conversation and understand and learn. So that would be the difference there. And then if priorities contradict, it's really interesting. I think too, when this is like very adaptive and very relational, and it's not a traditional form of leadership or of working together, because typically we want to just get things done and delegate and do it and just assume that we're doing the work. And, I assume that I really have an assumption now that I want to work together and I want to understand how we're doing this work and who's doing what and how we're caring for each other in this work. And then when I have people I'm working with who make an assumption, or I can see that the tone changes and I can see that they might be frustrated with how things are unfolding, but they're not talking about it, then we haven't, then it's a time to go back and revisit those community agreements. So this is always a place to go back. So when you feel dissent and then justice and discipline in this relational method too is another thing, that when you have circle, hypothetical or metaphorical and or literal, you can come to consensus and take the time and value that and come to consensus. And okay, so I hope that helps. Also, again, please email if you have other questions. I will share my email. Okay, and let me just look. We have a couple minutes. I'll look. How does one reconcile the challenge posed by the implicit power imbalance that the person posing a question sets the stage for who is included and how they become with the team with the anti-oppressive framework? That is it's a very important question. So what I would say, again, I cannot emphasize enough these community agreements, but also I understand in a workplace culture that this needs to be, you can, in your small co-design teams, you can start making these changes and these movements and seeing how this feels. Because power and power dynamics are also part of the Western dominant narrative that we live in. So when we're undoing colonial systems, we have to look differently at power. And when you loosen and have shared leadership, it doesn't mean the job doesn't get done. It doesn't mean that everybody does all the work at the same time. But there's I don't know, if you think of the idea of a beehive and think of a colony of bees and think of how that, if a very vibrant, healthy hive is doing well because everybody's doing their job. And the queen bee is not doing everything. But the queen bee is also, I would say, finger on the pulse of knowing exactly the system. So I want to leave that with you, of that analogy of the beehive, and thinking like, how can everybody be doing the work respectfully and understanding? You know, it goes back to relationships, caring for each other and caring for the whole hive. So your whole team or your whole organization. And so I will, I know our time is up, but thank you for the excellent questions. I really love the engagement. We'll share the slides for sure. And I will also leave my email address. They can be shared out with the slides if you have any further questions. So I just want to thank you all so much.
Thank you, Stephanie, and great questions, everyone. And thank you for taking the time to answer those questions. And just for those that asked about the slides and all that, we will be posting this webinar. So it should be up in a couple days. And so people that are interested in sharing that with their teams, please do so and make sure to kind of spread that widely. And Stephanie was so kind to extend the invite for people to email her as well, which is great. And so again, just very quickly, our next webinar will be on March 21st. That'll be the third webinar in our series, and so look forward to seeing you there. And for those Passerelle fellows, encourage you to stay on, and we'll have a half-hour meet and greet with Dr. Bartlett, and looking forward to that additional opportunity to have a conversation there. So again, thank you, Stephanie, so much for your time and for providing us with this webinar today.
Thank you so much.